In the summer of 1914, the French financier Albert Kahn commissioned photographers to document the lives of his fellow countrymen and women all over France. Kahn's photographers were equipped with the autochrome system, the world's first photographic process capable of taking true color images. Just days after these pictures were taken, the men, women and children captured in the photos would be embroiled in war.
The civilian story of any war is not very often told. It's more complicated than the story of the soldiers. It's not just soldiers that go to war, it's a whole society.
Kahn's autochromes are unique. I don't think there is a collection of color photography of the Great War anywhere in the world like it.
In the early years of the 20th century, Albert Kahn had dreamt of producing a pictorial archive of life around the world. But events were about to force Kahn to change the focus of his photographic project. On the 1st of August 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. In response, Russia's ally France immediately mobilized her men.
Across France in 1914, the Minister of the Interior sent 38,000 telegrams to 38,000 mayors. And these mayors would come out and nail to the door of the Hôtel de Ville, the mairie, a proclamation of general mobilization, and then 2 days later, a proclamation of the declaration of war. So a mobilization order is a signal for the breakup of families, and was taken to be a dire, miserable document.
At the time, in rural France, most people were working in the fields. A sound that hadn't been heard for decades was about to shatter the silence of summer.
The local priest would immediately go to sound the tocsin. The tocsin is the medieval call for an emergency in the village, characteristically fire. But this was a fire that was burning all over Europe.
When they heard in the field this bell, they thought that it was very, very bad, and they understood it was war. And a teacher who wrote a memoir about that wrote that a very old woman said, "It is the bell for our boys to die."
On the 3rd of August, Germany officially declared war on France. Kahn sent his cameras to document the scene as 3 million Frenchmen prepared to fight for their country.
At train stations, it was chaos because you have middle class, upper middle class people coming back from their holidays trying to get home. You have young men trying to get to their mobilization points. And nobody really knows what's happening. So there's a kind of collective holding of breath for the victory that was supposed to happen, you know, within a couple of days or maybe a week or two.
But hopes of an early victory were dashed when the German army advanced into France.
The invasion of the north of France took the French government and army by surprise. They expected the German advance to be from the east. Most of the French army was there, facing them, and the Germans instead decided to invade through Belgium and northern France in a giant circle.
And then suddenly, on the 24th of August, came the latest news of the day. The line of the front from the Somme to the Vosges. The Somme? The Somme's 100 miles into France. Nobody had realized that the French were fighting on French soil at that point. And then came the horde of refugees, 500,000 of them in all, French, and many more from Belgium, filling up Paris. And then the awful realization by the beginning of September that the Germans were only, in fact, about 30 or 40 kilometers away from Paris itself.
As French and Belgian refugees flooded into the capital, a reverse migration took place. Rich Parisians fled from the city. One of Kahn's friends, the American journalist Herbert Gibbons, described the scene.
As the German invasion spread and drew nearer to Paris, the refugees appeared in our streets with their salvaged household goods. As the refugees poured in, the cowards poured out. The two streams met at the railway stations and the city gates, each fleeing before the Germans, but in a different direction.
Paris padded its buildings and monuments with sandbags as the capital braced itself for war. Almost all men of military age had left for the front. Overnight, one of the most vibrant cities in Europe was deserted.
It was a ghost town. The rich had gone. The prostitutes went with them. The city was so far from the illuminated masterpiece that it had been for decades.
The First Battle of the Marne halted the German advance on Paris, but at a price. 500,000 Allied troops were killed or wounded. On September the 15th, troops started digging the first trenches at the Western Front. 4 years of stalemate was about to begin. Kahn negotiated with the military to get his photographers as close to the action as the army would allow.
These areas were off limits to those without permission. But Albert Kahn managed to get his photographers letters of safe passage. This shows that Albert Kahn had influence with the military and the government.
The army also understood that if they did not let photographers, perhaps nobody would know what was happening, and the photographers would help them to show what was their patriotic duty in front of the Boche.
In December 1914, the director of the Kahn archive, Jean Brune, accompanied 2 photographers on a mission just behind the French battlefront. Brune described the places they went to as corpse-like towns. He would later show the findings of this mission in a series of lectures.
These photographs are incredibly powerful. They come to symbolise La France éternelle, eternal France, and all the values that are associated with that. Therefore, it had real meaning to see exactly what the barbarian was prepared to destroy of France.
Kahn was aware that to show images of the dead and wounded would damage morale, but he found another way to represent the suffering of France.
French photographers took a lot of photos of ruined churches. Why did they choose the churches? Because they wanted to show the immorality of the German, who would not respect anything, neither the children, nor the women, nor the house of God.
The devastation of 20th century warfare is artillery fire. Artillery killed 60% of the men who died in the First World War. And instead of showing dead French bodies, you could show dead French churches. They are, in some ways, the symbol for the human losses of France. To tear up the land, to tear up the churches, to tear up the homes, is an indirect way of talking about the carnage, which was very difficult to show at the same time.
When they reached the town of Gerbevilliers in northeastern France, Kahn's photographers were just 6 kilometers from the fighting. As the Germans swept through the town, the French had retreated. Sharpshooters were left behind to defend the bridge. But on August the 21st, the Germans took control of the town. They assumed that the locals had aided the French army. As punishment, 60 civilians were shot. The town's hospital, full of wounded and dying, also came under attack. It was the unlikely figure of a nun, Sister Julie, who saved both hospital and its patients.
An officer came up to my patients. The poor little ones trembled. I put myself between them and him and said, "Don't you touch them."
Postcards celebrating her bravery were sold throughout France. But Sister Julie's portrait wasn't an entirely faithful representation of reality.
Well, there was a kind of stereotype invasion heroine who shows up in a number of different stories. They're always young, they're always pretty, they're always fragile, who stand up and confront, the brutal Hun and triumph via their dignity and their representation of French civilization. Sister Julie did not fit that stereotype. She was elderly, she was short, she was quite squat, and from her photograph she looks grim. You can definitely see her taking on the Germans, no problem. Probably the patience as well.
For her bravery, Sister Julie would receive France's highest decoration, the Légion d'honneur. On average, France was losing 900 men a day. The country badly needed heroes and heroines to maintain morale. Back in Paris, Brune exhibited his shocking pictures of the destruction at the Western Front in a series of public lectures at the Collège de France.
The Collège de France is, in many ways, the high temple of French learning. Hence, to bring to the attention of the most learned parts of the population the dreadful events that are happening is to secure further the union sacrée, the merging together of different elements within French society to throw the German invader off their soil.
At the time, there was very few photographs shown. At the time, photographs was new, and photographs was very little in evidence. And suddenly, the Collège de France, the higher institution of learning in this country, was taking photographs very seriously and was showing them as evidence of patriotism and evidence of the destruction by the enemy.
This was the second time within living memory that Germany had invaded France. After the Franco-Prussian War, Germany had annexed Albert Kahn's birthplace, Alsace.
In his youth, Kahn experienced the impact of the 1870 war between France and Germany, which for him had direct consequences. He left his homeland of Alsace for Paris. He fought all his life for peace, and for him the relationship between Germany and France was crucial.
He was a Republican, a Universalist. He thought the Republic was a regime of peace, and therefore he thought that in fighting the Germans, one was fighting war itself. This was to be the war to end all war. And the worse it got, and the more awful the destruction, and the greater the death toll, then the stronger was the onus on people like Albert Kahn, internationalists, people who thought of peace, to imagine a future world free of war, which somehow retrospectively would make all this suffering worthwhile.
Kahn also documented how unoccupied France coped in the shadow of war.
In the First World War, Kahn's Archives of the Planet didn't limit itself to just documenting the destruction behind the front line. There are also a lot of images taken in the countryside. These images of rural life are in a way at the heart of the Archives of the Planet. Kahn was interested in how the world was changing, and this change is interesting to see at a time when the country is affected by war. There was destruction, but elsewhere life continued.
These photographs recalled a population who were in danger of losing their healthy young men. Agricultural work had to continue, even though the strongest labourers were at the front.
Farming is, in some sense, the antithesis of war. It is about fertility, it's about growth, it's not about destruction. If you lived in the countryside, you had a very hard war. The farm work had to be done anyway, and usually without the men and without the animals. And what that meant is that the elderly went back to back-breaking work. Women did the work that animals did, pulling the plows.
Families were fractured. Women and old people were left not only trying to do the farm work, but also trying to maintain the family. It was the women who wrote to the men, and often the men in the trenches wanted to know what was happening back on the family farm, whether that bottom meadow had been mowed or not, and how much had been got for the cow that had been sold. In that sense, there was a constant psychological investment in the war and emotional investment in the war by rural France, even though they may have been hundreds of miles away from the battlefields.
By 1916, the front stretched from Switzerland to the English Channel. Germany had made significant territorial advances, but its success meant that it now had to feed around 2.5 million French civilians in occupied territory.
They therefore tried to send a large number of what they called mouths that they couldn't feed back to France, so there'd be a charge on the French war effort. Old people, women and children were repatriated through Switzerland and Evian into France.
During the occupation, there were all kinds of measures to help the refugees. And obviously, one of the measures was to get them out, because there was nothing to eat. There was no work there. And the situation of the people of the North was absolutely terrible and miserable.
A former émigré himself, Kahn instructed his cameramen to film the arrival of the refugees from occupied France. Their path back lay through neutral Switzerland. The final destination for many was the French town of Evian.
Initially, there was a very considerable outpouring of sympathy for them, of local charity and help. But as the war went on, as the war dragged on, tensions quite often developed between the refugees and the local population. Sometimes they were even disparagingly referred to as les Boches du Nord, the Germans of the North.
French soldiers were suffering too. The Battle of Verdun resulted in 400,000 casualties. It was one of the bloodiest episodes of the Great War. But the French did manage to regain some territory. Keen to document life at the front, Kahn struck a deal with the French military to fund the work of 2 army photographers, Fernand Cuville and Paul Castelnau. In return, each photographer would take 2 plates of each image, one for Kahn's archive, the other for the army's. The first assignment given to Cuville and Castelnau was to record the impact of the war on the capital of the Champagne district, Reims. In 1914, German shells had struck the city's most famous building.
The cathedral is historically where the kings of France were crowned. This was also one of France's most beautiful Gothic cathedrals and a jewel for the Roman Catholic Church in France, which was being destroyed.
The German shells caused an inferno that could be seen for miles around. The fierce flames melted the roof of the cathedral, and the gargoyles were seen to spit molten lead.
It is a place where you can see the meaning of German war crimes. If the attack is on an army, that's one thing. If it's on a civilian population, that's entirely another. And if it's on a cathedral, it's an attack on humanity, on the values that are supposedly shared by Germans and French alike.
When Castelnau and Cuville arrived in Reims in January 1917, they found a city under siege. Many of their most potent images feature children living in the war zone.
Here we have a very powerful image. The children, trapped in the awful torment of war, carry with them the hope of a peaceful future. In the eyes of Albert Kahn, and clearly his photographers, these children are the future of peace.
The little girl is a symbol of all the women who have changed role. Most of the women before the war will take care of their children. She takes care of her doll. The little, nice little kid could be just little propaganda. But it is much more than that. It is really a way to explain the incredible impact of total war.
Reims was shelled for over 1,000 days. In a city under such heavy bombardment, every day was a living nightmare. The experience is still remembered by the relatives of those who endured it.
This is my brother, Jean Creton, whom I'm named after. Here in 1917, he's 6 years old. My brother always played around in front of the cathedral. He used to talk to the statue called the Smiling Angel of Reims. German troops were in the hills behind the town. They fired. The shells were so fast the town didn't even have time to put on the air raid siren. It surprised everyone. And then a shell exploded in front of the cathedral. My mother looked for her son everywhere. She called, Jean, Jean.
Elle cherchait mon frère partout dans les décombres, elle le trouvait pas. Elle l'appelait Jean, 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 Jean.
She finally found him in the rubble, in front of the cathedral.
Devant la cathédrale. Alors elle l'a ramassé.
She picked him up in her arms. My brother stayed alive for just 5 hours more.
Dans les bras de ma mère.
In this picture, he's relaxed. He was killed only a few months after it was taken.
The heroism of the people of Reims was glorified across France.
Reims was used as an emblem for the rest of France. It allowed civilians that were 400, 500, 600 kilometers from the front to be aware of what was going on and to see that this war directly affected civilians.
Couville and Castelnau spent 2 months living in Reims, recording the damage to its buildings and its people. Many subjects stare patiently at the cameras in response to the long exposure times needed for color autochromes.
When a photograph is taken in color, it takes a long time. The time of pose is very long. What do you do at war? You wait all the time. You wait for the orders. You wait for the time of the battle. You wait for the awful time when you hear of the loss. And the waiting in the photos and the waiting at war go so well together that it is like the symbol of what this war was about.
At the start of the war, Reims had been home to 113,000 people. By the time Castelnau and Couville arrived in 1917, most of the population had fled. Only 14,000 inhabitants dared remain in the city.
This is a fascinating image of wartime France. It raises a couple of questions. Are those soldiers simply helping civilians who need to move away from the dangers of the military zone to the safety of the interior? Or are they up to something else? Because one of the things that French civilians in the military zone discovered in the First World War was the attitudes of French, British and German soldiers towards their possessions was remarkably similar. It could be Louis Kahn's furniture, it could be silk curtains, toys, brass stair rods, everything would go. They would empty their houses en masse. These would be either for sale or for firewood.
But for those who remained, war presented excellent opportunities to make a profit.
Prices were hugely inflated, not just in Reims, but across the whole of France. For example, in just 2 years, the price of a kilo of potatoes tripled. This was a serious problem, especially for the working class.
This photograph shows that one could be relatively well fed in France if you had the money. What we see is a charcuterie filled with tins. We also have a very interesting contrast in the picture between the woman and the soldier who's staring longingly through the window. The soldiers often accused the shopkeepers behind the front of exploiting them, of charging too much. And it's quite possible that this soldier can't afford any of the things that he sees in the window.
I think this is the sort of image that would have really enraged patriotic France. It is your pudgy husband and wife cafe owner, those who are making an awful lot of money from the troops who are going to fight at the front. They are the arch profiteers of wartime France. And in most of the novels that were written during the war, you always have a scene where your sort of mud-splattered soldiers coming from the front are desperate for a drink in a local bar. They've only got a few francs in their pockets. They arrive there, and of course, Madame is at the bar, and she is not prepared to serve them simply because they haven't got enough money on them.
During their time in Reims, Kahn's photographers shot over 1,000 autochromes. They chronicle the comprehensive devastation of the city. By the spring of 1917, the military ordered a complete evacuation. It was simply too dangerous to stay. But Kahn's photographers continued to record life at the front line. Their next stop was 50 kilometers west, in the town of Soissons.
They arrived in Soissons at just the right time. The Germans had retreated and were 15 kilometers away. Everyone thought that now life would be able to start again. Soissons had been on the front line for 3 years, and people came to see what state the town was in.
In the spring of 1917, the French launched the Nivelle offensive, a determined attempt to push back the Western Front. But the offensive was a failure. In nearby Soissons, the hospitals expected a maximum of 10,000 patients, but they received 100,000 wounded in a week. To cope with the casualties, grand country houses were turned into makeshift hospitals.
Well, this is a photo of a typical chateau that could be turned into a hospital, as this one was. We tend to think of hospitals as being run by men, but these auxiliary hospitals, particularly the ones that were set up privately in private homes like this chateau, were usually run by a woman. And often they didn't even have a doctor in residence there. The doctor would move around among a number of, small facilities in the area. And it was the head nurse who was really in charge.
Over 60,000 women volunteered as nurses, but most found the work less glamorous and heroic than they'd imagined.
The wartime nursing, particularly these volunteer nurses, were not very well trained, were often not trained at all, and mostly nursing was menial work, so that Red Cross nurses would not only be, caring for the wounded, doing bandaging, but also preparing food, doing laundry. And this would be fairly typical of work that was required of the Red Cross volunteers.
But there were some volunteers who took their responsibilities very seriously.
C'est ma grand-mère paternelle.
This is my grandmother, who we all called Mimi.
Car nous l'appelions Mimi. Mimi a été une femme très belle.
Mimi was a very beautiful woman and quite a flirt.
Et très coquette. Donc elle a
She was always surrounded by people, because a beautiful woman easily finds herself surrounded.
Très facilement. Mais elle n'était
She
pas
wasn't a do-gooder.
bonnes œuvres, si vous voulez.
She wasn't a social butterfly who sat around gossiping with a cup of tea.
Qui boivent la tasse de thé, pardon, messieurs des Anglais. Mais qui,
As it would turn out, she did get close to the action.
Et elle était beaucoup plus proche de l'action, ce qui s'est prouvé.
For society ladies in Paris, white nursing uniforms were very much in vogue. But for nurses at the front, the reality of war was dirty and bloody. Madame Andrieux wrote in her diary,
One of the soldiers who had lost his right buttock had the courage to hobble for a day and a half over 15 kilometers. By the time he got to the ambulance, he was dragging himself on his stomach and knees. They tell stories of so many atrocities. Young men call for their mothers when the pain is too much. This breaks my heart.
Elle disait combien
She talked about waiting to find out if the Germans were advancing or being pushed back.
The
The shelling, the deafening sound of the cannons. She never complained, but she said that it was
Elle ne
horrendous.
s'est jamais plainte, elle a dit c'était épouvantable.
For her bravery under fire, Mireille Andrieux was awarded the Croix de Guerre, the French military cross. A year later, in May 1918, Mireille Andrieux was forced to leave Soissons. The Germans took control of the town, and Mimi was evacuated to Paris. But during Fernand Cuville's next photographic mission, he recorded a French victory. He travelled east to Alsace, the birthplace of Albert Kahn.
Alsace was a disputed part of Europe. Both the French and the Germans had legitimate claims to it. It had been German since 1870, French for 100 years before that, German before that, and so on. And in 1917, it was part of Germany, but the French had conquered a few square miles of southwestern Alsace, and that's where the front line stabilized.
They managed to hold on to a thin border strip around the village of Thann. This was occupied by the French military throughout the war and provided the perfect opportunity for various French dignitaries and clearly the photographers of Albert Kahn to go down and to photograph young women apparently in Alsatian traditional dress. In point of fact, it was a traditional dress for only one small part of Alsace. This particular version of it became invented for wartime purposes as the single symbol of Alsace. For Albert Kahn, it would have been deeply moving to know that part of Alsace had been retaken by the French army.
Back at his mansion, Kahn arranged meetings for the French cultural elite. He showed them images of the people and places on the front line, which had a powerful impact on his audience. These images of France under fire encouraged members of Kahn's circle to make contributions to National Aid, a charity he'd established to help the civilians affected by the war.
His charity, National Aid, was founded to help the refugees from the war zones. Kahn's first thought was to help them and find a way to ease their burden. During the First World War, his charity gave 6 million meals to these refugees.
At the height of the conflict, Kahn described his aversion to war.
The storm shaking the earth touches every living being and has destroyed all dreams of humanity. The question we must answer is, will it be the German sword or humanity that will triumph?
To achieve victory, France needed weapons. Surprisingly, over 500,000 soldiers were deployed at munitions factories in Paris. But even this wasn't enough to satisfy the army's needs. The factories desperately needed more recruits. So, for the first time, massive numbers of women joined parts of the workforce that had been the preserve of men. Employment opportunities had improved, but the cost of living was rising, and food was in short supply. As a result, many workers went on strike.
Yes, it's rather surprising to discover that there were strikes, but shortages of a number of really essential goods became severe, particularly coal. It was a very cold winter. The coal fields, a number of them had been occupied by the Germans. Plus, there was tremendous demand for coal from industry at this point as well, from the munitions factory. So Parisians were going cold. There were also shortages of sugar, of meat. Prices went sky high, of all dairy products. Standard of living became more difficult.
It wasn't just France that was suffering. Deprivation and war weariness affected the whole of Europe. France's ally Russia had been torn apart by revolution. Eventually, it would withdraw from the war. Germany, too, was teetering on the brink of revolt. But a powerful new ally entered the conflict, one capable of tipping the balance in France's favor. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Albert Kahn wrote,
"The decision of the people of the United States to throw in their lot with the nations that are fighting for human dignity is confirmation that a new epoch is about to be born."
In June, 100,000 American troops arrived on French soil. For Kahn, it was a vital development that demonstrated the importance of international collaboration. His filmmakers recorded this momentous occasion.
Seeing a sign, American Red Cross, was to see the future. The Russian Revolution knocked Russia out of the war. The United States basically filled that gap. It's not so much that the Americans won the war, it's that their presence was a stiffening of the will to fight after 3 years of an extremely bitter and painful conflict.
By 1918, France had suffered unprecedented destruction. America may have entered the war, but Germany had acquired a new weapon that now threatened Paris. It was a gun that could hit targets more than 70 miles away. It was nicknamed Big Bertha.
The Germans had developed a long-range gun that was intermittently shelling Paris. It was extremely frightening for Parisians who knew about the kind of destruction that shelling had wreaked upon cities in northern France. The taping of the glass on the shop window, this was kind of futile effort to try to protect windows from these shells.
My
mother told me that when the Big Bertha warning sounded, my grandmother would call to her neighbor. She'd shout, "Madame Gilles, we have to go into the cellar." But Madame Gilles was deaf and never heard her cries. Grandmother had to go and fetch her to come to the shelter. Otherwise she'd have stayed in her flat.
No one knew what the outcome of the war would be, and the outcome of Paris was identical to the outcome of the war. German victory meant the occupation of Paris. It was on the front line.
Fearing that Paris might fall to the enemy, Kahn redoubled his attempts to record the city before it was too late.
There was an extensive amount of footage being taken of the Parisian buildings and streets, etc., because there was a fear that Paris was potentially under threat. Part of this comprehensive recording that was going on during this period was with the intention of perhaps rebuilding Paris were it to be destroyed.
In August 1918, the Allied powers broke through the front line and gained the upper hand. In Germany, economic instability and disillusionment with Kaiser Wilhelm made the country vulnerable to revolution from within. At the start of November, the Kaiser abdicated. After 4 years of unprecedented bloodshed, Germany's resolve finally caved in, and an armistice was declared. bells rang out once more across France, but this time they heralded a new era: peace.
Ma mère se souvient du 11 novembre.
On the 11th of November, my mother remembers being at school.
11h du matin à peu près, et ils ont entendu.
At 11 o'clock, they heard the bells ringing from Notre Dame. But the school children didn't know what was going on.
Ce qui se passait, mais la maîtresse était.
Their teacher, though, was very emotional. She understood that war was over.
La guerre était terminée, et donc l'après-midi, ils n'ont pas eu.
In the afternoon, there was no school, and my grandmother took her two daughters out onto the streets to see people celebrating the end of the war.
Pour voir les premières réjouissances de cette fin de guerre.
This is an event that needs to be captured with a moving camera in order to represent the sheer randomness and movement and jubilation of the people on that day. And indeed, the footage does capture that, I think, in an incredible way. You see the crowd very aware of the Kahn cameraman, because there seems to be a real attention given towards the camera, and that they are, in a sense, celebrating because it's there to document them, it's there to capture them and this incredible moment for future generations.
Kahn's archive had documented 4 years of upheaval and destruction. During the Great War, he had amassed more than 2,000 colour photographs and commissioned hundreds of reels of film. In November 1918, he could at last record the outpouring of joy that was felt in Paris.
In the home front, there is really hysteria. People are so happy in the first few hours and even the first few days that they shout and dance and cry.
But there's also the other side in that you see in many of the memoirs, where saying, well, not everybody was happy. I mean, a lot of men aren't coming home. A lot of widows are coming out and applauding and are going to go home and cry.
Kahn's friend Herbert Gibbons wrote,
"Women in tears. That is the whole of this war, epitomized in 3 words.
It was an extraordinary moment, and its epic qualities can be captured by cinema and by photography better than almost anything else. What Kahn was able to do is to open the door onto an entire world describing the richness of the culture that was under threat by the German invasion of 1914 and that could have been wiped away.
Albert Kahn thought that he was going to create an archive of the planet, as he called it, documenting everything out there. And everything out there actually came into France and then ended up transforming the world that he thought he was documenting. He was suddenly precipitated into becoming the photographic chronicler of the biggest devastation which had occurred in Europe since the French Revolution.
Albert Kahn created a memory of a unique moment in time and recorded the civilians' experience of it. This memory is priceless. It's not a biased written account of that moment, but photography and film, taken at the actual time, and its images are in colour.
France and her allies were victorious, but the war had cost more than 8 million lives. Kahn's photographers had recorded Europe's descent into the bloodiest war there had ever been. Once hostilities had ended, the archive's photographers could again travel freely around the world. In the 1920s, Kahn increased the ambition of his project. His photographers travelled south to Africa, journeyed into Asia, and ventured deeper into the Middle East. And they experimented with new photographic technologies, allowing them to use film to record the colours of everyday life, just as their autochromes had done. As a new decade unfolded, these photographers would circumnavigate the globe to capture images for Albert Kahn's Archives of the Planet.